Session 3, Workshop 7 of the Ed Collab Gathering. This session is The Power of Story, using writing as a way to form community, take risks, and help students see themselves in our curriculum. Our presenter is Maggie Roberts, an internationally recognized expert in elementary and secondary literacy, content area literacy, and technology integration. She is also co-author of the popular book, DIY Literacy, Teaching Tools for Differentiation, Rigor, and Independence. Here we go.
Hi, are we all good? I imagine we are. Hello, hello. It's nice to feel everybody tuned in. I can't see everybody, but I can feel everybody. And I'm always just as nervous presenting these online sessions as I am in person. So I'll take a deep breath. And I'll begin at the beginning. This is a session on the power of story. And the 3 goals I set for myself for this session are to kind of think about ideas that can help us as teachers use writing to form community, to use writing to take risks, and to use writing to reflect all of our children's stories. And there are a couple of digital goodies that I collected for you. So I'm going to go ahead and start just by showing you my first slide. Oh, good. You're already there. Fantastic. Someone's there. Okay. And so if you head over to padlet.com/Maggie Beatty Roberts /The Power of Story, you'll be able to investigate those resources during this presentation. And I bet somebody out there could save my day and even tweet that link. Padlet.com/Maggie Beatty Roberts /The Power of Story. Okay. And we're going to begin with, I don't know. I mean, if we're doing a session on the power of story, we have to begin with our own story. So I want to begin. Oh, hold on one second. Let me make sure people are seeing the slide. Okay. All right, I want to try one more time. I want to make sure that my slide is being shared. Oh, there it goes. That might have worked, right? The power of story. So the Padlet resource is padlet.com/Maggie Beatty Roberts /The Power of Story. Yay, the slide is being seen. So I'll take a moment just to wait there to make sure that people can grab that. All right. So if we're doing a session on the power of story, it feels powerful to begin with our own. And there are lots of different ways to begin thinking about our different origin stories and how we see ourselves as a narrative. And one of my favorites is from taken from inspiration from Facing History and Ourselves. And there's a lot of different renditions of this activity, but for me, it's taking note of how I identify in this moment in time. If I think about brainstorming a list of qualities or categories that I feel like I belong to, I might think about my age, my gender, my physical characteristics, my hobbies, my profession, perhaps my ties to religion, ethnicity, my neighborhood, my culture. And if we momentarily defined identity as something that is constructed and something that is rooted in lots of different experiences. And that identity is on a spectrum, and at different points of my life, I might more strongly identify with some categories than the other. This is my current snapshot of the different categories that I identify with. And I kind of played with space a little bit. The categories that are closer to the me are things that came to my mind first. And then as I drifted into other categories, I start to, put them towards the outside. But I want to especially kind of bring your attention to a few categories because a subtitle of this presentation is using story to take risks and to help our students take risks. And so if I am embracing the power of story, I want to think about the small risks that I can feel comfortable taking as an educator. If I write with my kids, if I read with my kids, if I teach history to my kids. And so here are a couple of kind of sub-identities that will come out in this presentation as I do some demonstration for you. One, I've been thinking a lot about how I grew up working poor and how I didn't totally, let me see, I'm going to stop screen sharing just for a moment so I can connect with you. One of those identity pieces that I'm thinking about a lot recently is growing up working poor. And I don't think I had access to that definition or for myself. But in recent years, returning home and in recent years, having the responsibilities of feeding young children and thinking about budgets, that's an identity that I've been more strongly kind of thinking of myself with. And also just a child of divorced parents, that felt not as common as it was. I'm in a family with two moms. So right now, strongly identifying with my LGBTQ community. So just take a moment and hold the space for yourself and just get a sense of, if you were to brainstorm an identity map for how you identify in this current moment in time, perhaps thinking of political affiliations or your ethnicity or your ties to any type of religion or spirituality, where you are in the world. Identify strongly as an ex-New Yorker and a born Midwesterner. So I'll take a moment just for you to list a few categories, because we're going to root our work together today in those categories that you see for yourself. Thank you, Dominique, for tweeting out the Padlet link, and Travis. So as you're thinking about a few, some reflection questions that I want to throw out there for you to be thinking about are some of these, right? Like, when do some of these identities for you shine? Are there any identities that you identify with things that you hide? Parts of yourself or identities that come in useful in different situations? Perhaps you think about the emotion that you tie to these different identities. What identities are you proud of? What identities might you be ashamed? What identities do you feel indifferent about, righteous about, playful about? What identities do others have for you, right? If they were to see yourself, if your students were to see you, if your peers were to see you, if your family was to see you, what identities would they name for you? And is it the same that you see for yourself? So the big picture piece of this work, as we talk about the power of story today and using the power of our stories to help form community in our classroom, help create space for our kids and ourselves to take risks, and help our kids see themselves in the curriculum, is that we take these identities, this whole rainbow of identities that we have for ourselves, as our experience as readers and writers, thinkers and teachers. It has been said, and I agree wholeheartedly with the idea that Louise Rosenblatt put out there all those years ago, that reading is a transaction, right? It's a conversation that I can't help but separate myself from. And I bring myself to any text that I read and create meaning based on who I am and the conversation that's happening between that identity and the text. And so in the same way that reading is a transaction, writing is a personal act. You know, when we write, the words flow through our multiple identities that we see for ourselves, and we craft pieces of writing that shine the different parts of who we are, and we craft pieces of writing that hide the different parts of who we are. Writing helps us name who we value and who we don't, who we see and who is invisible. You know, as writers, and as teachers of writing, we have the opportunity to help ourselves and our students author ourselves into the world. And when we share our different stories and our identities as a lead storyteller in a classroom, we can literally help our kids write themselves into the world. And the opposite can happen, right? That words can erase. You know, I said that, you know, my son is being raised by two moms, right? He has a mama and a mommy. I'm mommy. And he will often say to himself when the four of us are playing downstairs on a Saturday morning, I've heard him say to himself, like, oh, because he's got a younger brother, he'll say, oh, we each have a mom to play with, right? Because there's like a disaster of co-playing happening right now. So we're man-on-man defense right now at the Roberts household. And you know, there was this moment we were reading a book that featured, I don't know, two gender neutral animal parents, right? So you couldn't really tell. And he said, without missing a beat, that that's the mom and that's the dad. And it's like, even with his own lived experiences that are telling him differently, all of the heteronormativity that saturates his world, our world, whether it's intentional or unintentional, has worn a groove into his subconscious of which kinds of people partner together and what makes a family. So I panicked, we panicked, and let me just share what we started to do with some of the books in our library. Let's see here. So we then did a little bit of this, right? Like I just took a Sharpie and I was like, oh my goodness, I need to go ahead and help write stories that represent my child. This is a fantastic story, by the way. Spork, it's on the Padlet. It is wonderful. And it's a beautiful story. It just happened to have a mommy and a daddy, and I wanted it to have a mama and a mommy. So, yeah, I'm back with you. And so it was my own kind of experience with this, but, you know, Matt de la Peña recently wrote a really beautiful piece in Time about the importance of not shielding children from darkness, right? It's on your Padlet. And the response to his piece by one of his favorite and mentor authors, Kate DiCamillo, just the titles kind of speak it all, right? That we shouldn't shield our children from darkness, and why children's books should be a little sad. And if that's a conversation that you're just catching up to, Matt has an amazing, beautiful new book called Love. And there is a illustration in that book that caused some controversy, to the point of like, is this picture gonna go or not? And join the conversation and take a look at that book and that picture and the two essays from those authors. And, you know, Matt really was, you know, helping me think about how important it is not to shield kids from who they are, and how when we present stories for our students, whether they're stories that we are writing with them, or we are, I'm going to take the bling out of my ears because they are hitting the microphone there. Bead bling, but beads. Yeah, the importance of not shielding kids from who they are, And so if you go back and look at that identity map, if we were all together in a room, I'd swing back to the slide, but you remember what it looks like. Questions that I might now pose when you look at your identity map is this idea of what books or authors or movies can you attach to the different identities that you have on your map, right? Like if I channel what Matt and Kate were saying, they were like, hey, it's really important that we have stories that reflect all of our students' experiences, even if they are difficult. Right. And so when I look at my map and I think about the identity of teacher, there's a lot of nonfiction that I attach to it. Immediately I think about my mentor, Greg Mitchie, and the books that he writes about teaching and how I really see my story or my hope, my wanted story in his narratives about teaching, or that scene from the Dead Poets Society. When I see myself identify as woman, I think about the authors Margaret Atwood and Sandra Cisneros and how their writing had me have this yes moment of I see myself in their work. As a queer identified person, authors like Michelle T, Dorothy Allison, Jackie Woodson, all lift me up with their narratives. And when I look at categories like working poor or a child of divorced parents, when I was preparing this to do this work with you all today, I was left with question marks. Like I didn't have as many authors or movies or books that were immediate that I could attach that book to that identity. And so if we were to ask ourselves some questions along that line of things, at what ages did these books attach to the different parts of your identity, right? It was for me a senior in high school that Margaret Atwood solidified in my personal canon of texts that were both reflective of me and inspired me. And I would also ask, how does it feel when you attach or see a book that represents your story? And how does it not feel? Or how does it feel when you can't attach, really? Alfred Tatum, who is an author and a teacher and an advocate of all young people, and especially advocates for marginalized boys of color. He writes about the importance of young people developing their own personal canon, and one that reflects and values their different identities and their different culture, right? That the traditional canon of literature can be one that is isolating and disempowering and is dominant of a narrative of someone else's story. And while we know that texts should be both mirrors and windows, right, reflective of ourself and opportunities to see other people's story, I want my son seeing lots of stories of kids that grow up in families that look a bunch of different ways, so that he has both mirrors and windows into the stories in his classroom and the stories that his teachers write and the stories that he lives. So when we come and write alongside our students, or we share our students, when we share our stories and ourselves with our kids, we just can't help but form community and encourage our kids to take risks and create opportunities for kids to see themselves. When we share our stories, Catherine Bomer, in her beautiful book, Writing a Life, talks about the Me Too moment, right? That when we hear somebody else's story, our brains tend to think of similar stories that we have. And of course, that Me Too moment resonates even stronger to me today in our current conversation about that. And so if we are lead learners in the room and lead scientists in the room and lead historians in the room, we also have to lead the story of kids, of all of our kids being able to say, oh, yeah, that reminds me of a moment that I have. Because since the beginning, we as a people have craved story. Right? We make meaning out of story. We create and we document and we revise our world through stories. Tom Newkirk I mean, everything he writes is incredible, but the one that really fits this presentation, it's on the Padlet, as well as Alfred's work and Catherine's work, is that our minds are made of story. That Newkirk talks in that book, Our Minds Are Made for Story, talks in great depth about how we learn and experience our lives through the power of story. And so if you think about how we've lived our lives through that, I could go back to biblical stories, fables and folk tales, origin stories to family neighborhoods or family stories or neighborhood legends. I can think of some great historians and mathematicians and scientists, and truly many of them are all storytellers. From my favorite media storyteller in history, Ken Burns, Stephen Hawkins. Like we learn and connect through story. So no matter what you teach, what grade level, whether you teach kids or adults, right? There's something quite powerful and primal about storytelling and knowing each other's story and creating our own shared stories. It helps create this unique patchwork of who we are and who we are together. In a moment, I'm going to be moving into a little mini writer's workshop with you to give you a few things. One, to give you strategies as a writer to generate powerful stories from your life and the stories that your kids need. A little bit of time to do your own writing or begin planting the seeds for your writing. And you also might take a moment and say, hey, if we've got 20 minutes left together, who's your audience, right? We're going to be writing some work together. These entries that you create might be entries for your students. They might be entries for your friends. They might be entries for yourself. So before we go into that writing workshop, I want to share my screen and head over to the Padlet and just shout out some of those names, those mentors of thinking of mine that I have when I do a quick workshop on the power of story. So I'll head there with you as well. Kristen, just let me know if you don't get there. Actually, no, I just want to share my entire screen, I believe. Okay. So you should be seeing the Padlet on your screen, especially if you haven't gotten there, right? It's just padlet.com/Maggie /the power of story. Great, you're all set. If you want the slideshow, I will take a risk and put my identity map up there so you have a mentor. But this is Newkirk's book that I was talking about. It feels like a really nice text to use because it really makes the argument of how we really read and write informational and persuasive texts and how we really read and write the world. Alfred Tatum's work is also fantastic and really talks about, in that book, Teaching Reading to Black Adolescent Males, talks about making sure that yes, there might be this historical traditional canon, but it is really important for kids to have a sense of what their own personal canon is. Catherine Bomer, her book, Writing a Life, Teaching Memoir, is still on my go-to grab bookshelf. And it has lots of different strategies and lessons for teaching memoir, which feels really apropos of what we're studying today. If I work backwards here, I'm going to give a shout out at the end to Zara Ahmed's new book, Being the Change. It's brand new. It's brilliant and so helpful. It's all lessons and strategies to teach social comprehension. And it feels like when we're talking about, sharing lots of different shades of stories from our lives, that feels like a really beautiful companion text. Here are the two articles that created a huge online conversation from Matt De La Pena and Kate DiCamillo. And Facing History was my mentor of all things learning about identity and how it shapes who we are. And that's a link to the lesson plan I took myself through when working on this presentation. There's lots of different versions of that. Okay, and then we'll go into the second part of this. now. Okay. So, digital writing workshop, here we go. I'd like you just to take a look at your map. I've got mine. And just get a sense of 2 or 3 identities on your map right now that feel underrepresented in some way. You know, for me, it might be when I was trying to find texts that I read as a kid that really validated people who struggled with money. That might be something that I circle. If my audience for this next 15 minutes or so is just myself, I might take a huge risk and put a kind of circle or star an identity that feels underrepresented in a way that I don't talk about a lot. What's nice is that since we're all here digitally, there's not really an audience for this except yourself. So for me, I'm going to say growing up poor is an identity that I want to focus on with you. Kids of divorced parents. I might do like I identify as a queer mother, right? An LGBTQ family. And then maybe a daughter. Spend a lot of my time now thinking about a mother, but might have daughters. So if you kind of work alongside me, it's like we're Bob Ross. It's like I'm doing a little happy little tree, then you're doing a little happy tree. If you don't know who Bob Ross is, you need to immediately shut down this presentation and go on your own action research project to figure that out. It's the best. Okay, so you have 2 or 3 identities on your map that feel underrepresented in some way. You might even take a moment and rank them in order of risk, right? So part of this workshop today is power of story, how writing together and sharing lots of different kinds of story helps us form a bond, but also helps ourselves and our kids take risks. So one might be low risk. You know, kid of divorced parents feels a little low risk for me. Growing up poor feels like a little bit of a medium risk. LGBTQ mom feels a little bit of a high risk for me. It's a new role for me. And I think that, you know, I spend a lot of my time as a writing teacher now, and also a reading teacher. I was going to grab the book and try to show you, but Christine Hertz and Christy Moratz have a beautiful new book out. Also, I'll throw it on the Padlet as well, called Kids First from Day One. And they really, I don't know, they just really mark the space and talk about storytelling as a method of teaching that's worth really, you know, dedicating page space to. And I find a lot of camaraderie with that. That as a teacher, you know, I've a long time thought about teaching as a performance art, you know, and there's all these different kind of stances that I take in the classroom. Sometimes I'm a coach, and sometimes I'm a scientist, and sometimes I'm a therapist, and a lot of times I'm a storyteller, and that there are methods to this way of teaching. And so these kind of subcategories that I'm defining for myself here are these ideas of like, these are going to be stories in my personal canon that are invitations for kids to see lots of different sides of themselves that I'm going to rehearse and I'm going to know backwards and forwards, so that these stories I can turn to when my lesson needs a little bit of empathy, or when I'm losing my kids in engagement, I might take out one of these stories as a way to say, hey, what's your Me Too moment to this? And so, you know, if I just stay with, I'm going to start the first strategy here with creating a mentor story of mine, or a collection of stories that reflect a kid growing up in the heartland in a farmhouse, whose father was a Beethoven scholar and classical pianist, and my mother was the original Martha Stewart, like stay-at-home mom extraordinaire. And, Beethoven scholars don't make a lot of money. I don't know if that surprises you, but we didn't have a lot of money. And one way that I can tap into creating some mentor stories of mine is I can think about emotions, right? Emotions that I have around that identity. That circles back to some of the work we did in the beginning of this session of like, how do you feel about all these parts of yourself? So if I think about emotions, as a kid growing up, kind of working poor, one emotion I think is an easy place for me to go is embarrassment, right? That even though I didn't have words for that side of myself, like I didn't feel great about it all the time. I have this story that I've rehearsed for a long time. It's the story of the Fila sneakers. And it's so well kind of grooved in my own and my family's history that my mom was just up a couple of weekends ago helping me garden for the first time. And I said, hey, you remember the Fila sneakers? And just those 2 words, she knows the story. And so it's a story that I've rehearsed of, my mom saving up upwards of like $100 over the course of weeks, if not months, to buy a brand new pair of Fila sneakers from Shoe Carnival, which was the place to go. And everybody had them. One of my friends had green, because if you remember Fila's, and if you don't know, action research on the side right now, be imaging resources for Fila sneakers. One of my friends had dark green. One of my friends had red. I got purple. I was ready, right? And my mom had saved up. You should know that my mom is wearing my old, what were they, like the Eastland loafers or the wool clogs or something that I had worn before that. Maybe the Keds sneakers. And she had this history of wearing my old sneakers because I hadn't worn them out yet. And so I go and I wear my first pair of Fila sneakers to middle school. They're so fresh that they're like squeaking on the waxed floors walking in to into my middle school. And everyone makes fun of me for it because I had waited so long to buy the Fila sneakers that they were out of style by this point. And I remember coming home and putting them away. And for days, my mother would be wondering why I wasn't wearing the Fila sneakers that we had saved for so long to get. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that I was made fun of and that the trend was over. I usually don't share this part with students, but I'll share it with you. Guess who wore the Fila sneakers? Got their worth for it. My heroic mother, who was, I think, the coolest mother wearing those purple Fila sneakers. It's a story I have in my bones to bring out because that embarrassment about material things, especially if a kid is real, I could live there, but I also could attach the emotion of happiness, right? Like growing up, what were some moments that I felt really happy in a home that was really, handmade from love. I have amazing memories of sitting at the kids' table for dinner and being like, yes, it's tuna melts again. We would have tuna melts, canned tuna, just American cheese. It was the best. And we had these applesauce, we'd have applesauce dishes and little raisins and brown sugar to make the hair. And years later, my mom would say, well, I just dressed up whatever we had. And it was cheap and it was good. But for me, there was so much magic in that dinner. Or my memories in the outdoor as a kid is just a lot of outdoor rugged play with our toys as, fallen trees and the mud that we had in the sandbox. So I gave myself a little gift of time, right, to get a sense of, okay, what's an identity that I may not always take a risk and talk about? What are some emotions that I have around that identity? And do those emotions lead me to memory? And one reason I'm storytelling with you to myself on the computer in this room is to inspire that Me Too moment that Catherine Bomer talks about. When you look at your map, and you think about emotions that you have with one of your identities, What emotions come up? What memories do you hold there? Could those be stories that you rehearse to help your kids see themselves in your classroom? I'm going to take a couple of minutes of think time for you to replicate some of that. Even if you're using this time to watch Bob Ross videos, I respect you. Okay. Let's take a moment and just do one more, shall we? Okay. So if I look at my identity map, one thing we said, we're just, are there some pieces, some sides of myself that are underrepresented in some way? Then which one feels like a riskier territory? Which one feels a little safer? I'm going to go into a slightly riskier, what feels equally as risky. I mean, I'm talking into the interwebs right now. It all feels quite risky. But I'm going to take a second and think about even as an adult, identity as a kid from a divorced family. And really, again, if we think about the power of storytelling, I'm telling these stories to connect with my kids and bring them into the lesson and have that moment with them. And so sometimes I'll pick different parts of my identity to really offer when I see a kid who's underrepresented in their school, in their community, in the world. And so really, again, if I just go back to that illustration in that picture book, Love, just the power that illustration has to normalize the unpleasant parts of being in family and being in family in crisis, right? And so as a kid from divorced parents, I could think about emotions as a window into memories that could help me rehearse some stories that I could use as a writer, as a teacher, as a reader. But I could also use places. I could be thinking about places that remind me as a kid growing up with divorced parents. And one place that I go is my family and I grew up in the heartland, and we would spend 3 days driving out in the summertime to Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where my grandparents had a tiny little rental cottage where we would escape the heat of Southern Illinois. Because again, I grew up farmhouse style, no AC, no dishwasher. We kept it simple. Still do out there. And so we would escape the Southern Illinois summers and drive 3 days in our Nissan Sentra two-door to the Cape. And I remember the first summer that we did that as a family of 3, not a family of 4. And I was older now, and we were driving through Kentucky, Western Kentucky in the summertime. And for those of you who know that area, tornadoes could spring up at any time, it must have been June. And I have this memory of being in the car with my mom, and now I'm in the driver's seat, not the driver's seat, the passenger seat in the front of the car. And I've got the atlas out, and I'm trying my best to navigate. And the sky is getting greener, and the wind is getting stiller. And if you're from tornado country, you know that means you got to get some shelter quickly. And my mom's driving heroically, Nissan Sentra, 2 doors. We're on day 1 of a 3-day trip by ourselves for the first time. She says, "Maggie, where's the next exit?" I mean, I'm like 13 years old. I really don't know how to read a map, and I have no idea, and I have no map literacy at all, and I have no idea where the boxes mean exits. And my now self really wishes Siri was there at the time just to say your exit's there. And I remember the feeling of, oh my goodness, this tornado's coming. I'm in charge of directions. I can't read the map. There was no tornado. It was fine. I wish it ended more dramatically than that. We did pull off underneath an overpass and kind of like hunker down for a moment, but there was no twister moment. But there's so much that lives inside that story, right? When our family dynamic changes, how then do we change? What responsibilities do we have? What responsibilities do we not have? I remember my dad's first house, and I remember the feel of it, the smell of it, the look of it. I write a lot of stories that take place in that new house as a backdrop to help kids see that home can be a lot of different places. So if you take a moment and look at your map and say, okay, I got an identity here, I have some emotion, but I can also think about places that I remember as I began to identify as mother, as teacher, as an ex-New Yorker. I do miss those Brooklyn stoops. And are there moments that I could rehearse in my writer's notebook or with colleagues around the coffee table or with my partner at home that can be stories, because it just feels good to tell stories, but stories that are anchors for all the different students we have in our classrooms. You know, we're asked to be a lot to a lot of kids in a short amount of time. And there are a lot of kids that my lived experience doesn't match their lived experience. But if I have stories that resonate across lots of different sides of myself, I widen the possibility that kids can see themselves in my classroom. So I have 5 writing tips when you're crafting stories as a way to create a mirror in your classroom, when you're crafting stories to create a window for kids in your classroom, when you're crafting stories just to connect and engage, to help set up content. I have 0 slide for you right now because I honestly ran out of time, but I will make one and I will talk with my hands. Tip number 1, demonstrate broadly, right? That my years working with the minds at the Reading and Writing Project at Teachers College Columbia, you know, one of my teachers, Mary Aaronworth, would really remind me that when we are collecting these stories that we are offering to kids as teaching material, we want to hit an emotional range. Like, I don't want to be Sally Sadpants all the time, but I also don't want to be just happy and cheerful all the time too. That even as someone who identifies feminine, female, a woman, a mother, a daughter, that I want to demonstrate stories that have both masculine and feminine sides to them. That I want to have some stories in my repertoire that are really safe, and some stories that I take out that might be a risk. So one tip is to demonstrate broadly. The second tip is to think about the age of your students. And as you're creating these mentor stories to use when teaching or when connecting with kids, you know, try to hit the age of your student a little younger, their age now, or a little older. You know, there's lots of stories I can tell as a adult, you know, burned out, you know, working parent. It's like, I don't know if like the 8-year-olds are really going to connect with that. So really thinking about, you know, sometimes I create an identity map of like, who would I be for like kindergarten, first grade, second grade? What would my shades of my identity be if I was walking into a high school, right? And I kind of have those prepped. So demonstrate broadly. Try to think about the age of your students. Tip number 3, really reflect the issues of your students and your community. You know, I now am a guest teacher. I get the gift of being a guest teacher in teachers' classrooms all over the country. You know, and it's like, it's not like it's like both the best time to teach and it's not the easiest time to teach. And sometimes I'll hear a lot of teachers saying, oh, we can't talk about that right now, or I don't want to get too, political, or, and I wonder if through story, right, that could be a potential safe place, not to get on a soapbox, but to reflect the issues that our kids are walking with on the way to the door of our classrooms, and the issues that are facing our community. Writing has the power both to create and erase. And it feels like we could have this moment to use writing to really reflect the issues that our students have. Tip number 4, speak up for the quiet, the more invisible identities in the room. Sometimes my loudest, most boisterous students have the quietest, shyest, most ashamed identities that they have for themselves. I can tell you by name, students that really speak to me with that. So, it doesn't have to necessarily be like the kid that sinks away, and those can, that's like kind of me, right? In middle school, like it would be great to have somebody public telling stories like that, but it also could be the loudest kid in the room and the slice of their identity that they keep quiet, that maybe they're told to keep quiet. And then tip number 5 is to use writing to offer counter narratives, different ways that this could go. Colin Cruz speaks really beautifully about that, of using writing to create and represent stories where it could just be as simple as like, the guy doesn't always get the girl at the end of the story, right? Just this idea, like I can use story to say, oh, there's another way that this could go. So to close, my friend Cornelius Minor, he says that once people know who you are, you don't have to hide anymore. And the first time I rehearsed this presentation was at the True Colors Conference at UConn. And it is, I think, one of the largest queer youth conferences in the country. And they were celebrating their 25th annual conference. And that was the first audience for this piece. And so really when we said that, right, once people know who you are, you don't have to hide anymore. We want our classrooms to be places of being, not places of hiding. We want to create spaces that help kids shine and not have to hide. We share our stories so that some of our kids don't have to. We share our stories so some of our kids can see themselves. We share our stories so that some kids can stand a little taller than they did before they came in the room. We share our stories to create space for ourselves, space for our students, and space to foster connection and empathy and understanding. Thank you for spending a little part of your Saturday with me. I look forward to the rest of the sessions and learning alongside with you. Thank you.
Maggie, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. The Ed Lab gathering continues with session 4 workshops, picturing possibilities using books as co-teachers, the who, what, when, where, and whys of student-centered coaching, and elective teachers unite, literacy and non-tested subjects. Don't forget about our adopted charity, No Kid Hungry, Pay the Joy Forward. Thank you so much.